Welcome back to Switch to Linux. Well, today I want to talk a little bit about the Wayland X debate. There's been some things going around, but we're going to end this with an article just written in the last 24 hours that was absolutely excellent. Had some examples about some of the dangers about using Wayland entirely. And so we're going to start here. How is the adoption of the Wayland protocol going for Linux? How many apps need it? This is, of course, from August this year on Quora. And this person who is a studied English literature and computer science person. Okay. So how's the adoption going? Slowly as it should, and you should be skeptical. Replacing X has been tried more than once, and all previous efforts have failed. Wayland is largely a solution looking for a problem. And I tend to agree. It's like people are mad at X because it's old. You know, we shouldn't completely replace old things just because they're old, only if they're fundamentally broken. Is X fundamentally broken? I'm not sure I've seen evidence of that. Old? Sure. Patchwork? Possibly. Absolute issues and problems all throughout. Haven't seen evidence of that. But Wayland's trying to get rid of this big patchwork and produce one unifying system. But as our final article will illustrate, it's not really solving a lot. In fact, it's bringing up more issues than it solves. In fact, that's what this person says. It causes as many problems as it wishes to solve. There's no reason X cannot be redesigned to achieve the same results through steady, testable revisions rather than trying to be replaced outright. So the Wayland devs are discovering they can't simply just reinvent a display server from scratch because there's a lot of gaps. And one of the challenges we have in Linux is some things are used more readily than others. You know, everybody wants to watch media or content and use a web browser and email. So those things tend to have faster development cycles than things like video production or more niche things that might require more detail from a display server like X that Wayland simply has no interest in actually solving, which means that we could get a worse, deeper fractioning inside of Linux than we have seen in a while. So Wayland has been around for 15 years. That was actually news to me. I didn't realize Wayland was so old. I'm not a developer. You'll have to forgive me. Well, not a Linux core component developer. Front-end websites and stuff, sure. It is only the last 2 to 3 years that Wayland compositors have been in a reasonably working state. So it took them 12 years to do. Of course, they were saying that X was old and we have to replace it 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, whereas X is really only 30 years old. So after it reached 15 years old, they're going, oh, that's too old. Got to thread it in for a new model, like some player. Furthermore, Wayland is primarily for Linux and FreeBSD, which basically assures that there's not a ton of support for it outside of those, i.e. into the Windows or Mac world. But curiously, also something I found out, one of the big pushes for Wayland is actually because the Apple developers don't want to work with it. That was interesting to me. So it's going to take a time before Wayland will completely replace X as a standard display server, if ever, and Wayland has a lot to prove. And they mention here the applications are not compiled against Wayland or X, are compiled against the intermediate libraries Qt and GTK, excuse me, which is also troubling because GTK has floated with making the next version drop 11 altogether. So anything running on X may simply not work at all under the next version of GTK. Qt, I have not seen one way or the other. But he is right. More and more people are starting to push Wayland as the default. Lubuntu 2404 will ship with an optional Wayland session. Optional Wayland session. That's good. Linux Mint beta just dropped. We should have the official 21.3 release soon. And with this, we are getting experimental Wayland support there as well. And so we can go between the default is still X with a optional Wayland as the option. Now, again, Wayland is going to be really good for people with some form of limited applications, but there are some fields that it does not work super well. We'll get to those at the end. So the team developing Linux for Apple Silicon Mac said they don't have the manpower to work on X support. In other words, so now does this mean they're going to work on Wayland? That's kind of how I initially interpret it, but thinking about it now as I'm just processing things on the fly, that might just mean, yeah, we're not just not going to support X. Let's just work on our own window manager. I do not know what Mac uses at all. Do they have their own custom system? Are they using Wayland? I have no idea. A year ago, the developers of GTK Toolkit said many Linux apps and desktops said that the next version may drop support for X, as is Solus is planning to entirely drop X. Now, there's a difference between dropping X and making Wayland the default. Can we understand that? I support a distribution like Ubuntu that says, we think Wayland is the future. Let's switch to Wayland by default. Because most people, to be sure, won't know the difference between X and Wayland. Let's go ahead and switch it to Wayland by default and let the bug reports roll in. That way, we can get a chance to fix things. This is why we know it doesn't work under some industries better than others. But for those that are in the know, they can simply go to that login screen and choose to log into Ubuntu via the X session instead of the Wayland session. And that is good. But if Solus wants to completely drop X altogether, that will completely exclude people from certain fields from using their system altogether. And that could be catastrophic for the project. So they're, of course, looking at KD6 wants to session to default to Wayland. They had made that announcement, or a proposal, we should say, not an announcement, but a proposal. Gnome Fedora has defaulted to Wayland. Again, defaulted, not dropped. And there's experimental efforts to get Wayland into OpenBSD. So there you have it. Now, here is from the register 3 signs that Wayland is becoming the favored way to get GUI on Linux. Again, we're seeing a more increase in applications that are testing for Wayland. That's good. I think that is certainly a good approach. And then we are seeing cases here where the X is being dropped from some projects, as we've already mentioned, and Mate is being dropped out of Solus because they say they have no credible or active Wayland strategy, putting it effectively on life support. And so there are certainly a few issues to keep in mind. But this brings us to the end. As the whole world is trying to push Wayland on everybody, there are at least a couple people saying we need to put on the brakes. And that brings us to this particular Wayland transition notes. These are some basic things. Wayland is or X is the concept, Wayland is the concept. So X specification versus Wayland has protocols. Neither of these have direct binaries that can be installed. Of course, X tells you specifications. How do you interact? Wayland says these are the protocols. We have to engage these. Now, the big critical difference is X is a universally shared default implementation, whereas Wayland has a variety of different components. And that really is what the problem is with Wayland, is it doesn't seem to work quite as well. Although I can say that in the last, not too long ago, what we're seeing worked out some of the best was actually that Pipewire is actually doing quite a bit with Wayland. And that seems to be the way that we can get OBS working, is to run it through Pipewire, and that will allow you to get some things working. Because as of right now, and it is on my list of things to do. I want to have a look at it in a separate video. How does OBS work on Wayland versus X? Being is that we have the new Linux Mint with the experimental Wayland support. We're going to have a look at OBS in a separate video and see how that works. And there are, in theory, ways to make it work, but nearly every way to make some component work, it's not through Wayland. It's by using a Wayland system that's going to call the underlying X. And that becomes the fundamental problem, is that half of the things that we see Wayland working on are simply working by Wayland calling the underlying X. And that really is the big problem. So in this article here, he writes, think twice before abandoning Xorg. Wayland breaks everything. And this is true because, as I mentioned, there's one particular major industry that does have a lot of problems, and that is video content creation. You see, I am recording this on Simple Screen Recorder, which does not work under Wayland at all. And the developer's like, there's too many problems. The reason is you can't just fix it for Wayland. You have to fix it for Wayland on Gnome, and fix it for Wayland on KDE, and fix it for Wayland on XFCE, and fix it for Wayland on XQT, and fix it for... So it becomes this massive thing because there's no underlying server to call. There's no underlying protocol to call. There is just a giant blob that you have to make it work for every little thing, which produces a massive bloat of code. And that's the big criticism against X. It's this massive bloat of code. Well, you basically have to say the display server is going to be a massive block of code and all of the applications call that code, or every application has become a giant bloat of code so that we have a really tiny display server. Like, what? Okay, common sense says you make the one universal thing the massive bloated block of code. All right, but that's really what he's talking about here, and we'll get more into that in a bit. So Wayland solves no issues, but I have, but it breaks almost everything. Even the most basic, most simple things like Xkill, in this case with no obvious replacement, and usually it stays broken because the Wayland folks mostly seem to care about automotive, Gnome, and maybe KDE, alienating everyone else. Basically, everyone else has to come up with solutions to make Wayland work. As I said, they usually do it just by starting X in the background and just calling X, which is how it's fixed in many cases. Wayland proponents Wayland proponents make it seem like Wayland is the successor of X, when in fact it is not. It is merely an incompatible alternative, and not even one that has or wants to have feature parity, i.e. missing features. And unlike X, Wayland protocol designers actively avoid the concept of windows making up incomprehensible words like XDG_top level instead. He says, do not use a Wayland session. Let Wayland not destroy everything and have other people fix the damage it causes, or force more Red Hat Gnome components, GitLab, glib portals, Pipewire on everyone. So that again is where we're getting the fixes, is not coming from the Wayland. They're just like, it works perfectly on my high-end Gnome computer. Great. Let's push it out. And that has become the mantra of modern computing anyway. Nobody wants to test anything on a bunch of different things. You know, I feel the same way working with a lot of these web softwares like Google Analytics 4.0. Oh, this is an atrocious nightmare. They just seem to assume that everybody has the highest speed gigabit internet connections on high level mega core massive DDR 725 computers, because it's the only way to get that crap to work right. You know? So anyway, people are saying, he says here, add more cases here, but Wayland seems to be made by people who do not care for existing software. They assume everyone is happy to either rewrite everything or just use Gnome on Linux. And that really is one of my big complaints. Sure, this works great on Gnome. I'm sorry, there are more desktop environments than Gnome. Gnome is not my forte. I am not interested in running a computer with Gnome. I think it's hot garbage. I think that the way they've pulled everything out of it, except a few little obscure things, is nonsense. I absolutely want to use my computer the way. That's why I like Linux, is because I have the ability to fully customize my system. This is my Linux Mint laptop, and it is exactly what I want it to be. And it's running X. Go figure. So Wayland is broken by design. A crash in the window manager takes down all running applications. You cannot do a lot of things you can do in X by design. There is not a single Wayland display server application that is desktop environment agnostic and used by everyone. So basically you have to write the server applications for every desktop, which is going to make Linux infinitely worse when Wayland is pushing everybody. It offloads a lot of work to each and every window manager. As a result, the same basic features get implemented differently in different window managers. with different behaviors and bugs. So what works on one environment does not necessarily work on another. So you hear it works in Wayland, even though it really works on Wayland in GNOME, not on Wayland in XFCE, and etc. So it breaks screen recording applications. This is my biggest complaint, because as a Linux content creator, I want to do everything on Linux, and I do everything on Linux. There are people in the tech or maybe /Linux space that they're not using Linux for all their production. They're going, well, this is my business, so we're going to use Windows for business, and we're going to talk about using Linux. No, everything I do is on Linux. Now, Lord willing, we'll have even some nicer effects come in as I'm learning some 3D studios and 2D animation studios and things right now. Maybe we'll see some better effects coming in. But the reality is I'm not recording a bunch of code and sending it to a third-party contractor who's putting it all together in Adobe After Effects on Windows or Mac and sending it back. And wow, we have new Linux content created on Windows and Mac. No, I'm sorry. My entire production flow is done on Linux. The problem is, none of these applications work under Wayland. Okay, simple screen recorder. The easiest, best, simplest screen recording application. It just doesn't work on Wayland. We have the green recorder. So this is no longer interested in working on this, implementing FFmpeg, Wayland, GNOME Screencaster, or solving issues related to them or why they don't work. By the way, there is like screen recording on GNOME by default now, but if I remember correctly, I don't think it records audio. I ran into that issue on Tails. You can record the screen, but there's no audio. But I also found it only records some 30-second implements. So the recent video we did on cubes, I kind of initially wanted to do on Tails, but there was no competent screen recorder. Wayland! That's why! Wayland! OBS project. Wayland is unsupported this time, back in 2020, broken. Let's see. Now, there are a few workarounds. The big workaround, again, look, it requires that XDG portal, which is the portal plugin that makes it work underlying with X. Even that's unpredictable. There is a workaround in Ubuntu where you can call it in the terminal, telling it specifically to use X, even though you're using Wayland by default, but then it raises some questions. But now you have to do weird customizations to get a simple application like OBS to work, whereas on X it works perfectly. There are some workarounds for these. So screen sharing applications. So Jitsi Meet had some issues, and even as of November 2023, that's just last month, screen sharing in Jitsi Meet and Chromium is still utterly broken, both on Raspberry Pi OS and KDE Plasma install, albeit with different behavior. Note that Pipewire portals and whatnot are installed, and even through them, it does not want to work. So if you're trying to do screen sharing video conferencing on Linux and you have Wayland, it might be a problem. You might want to test that. Zoom is broken since at least 2019. You can't start share. We only support Wayland on GNOME. Oh, isn't that nice? Debian 9, let's see, no word about non-GNOME. So they'll support it on GNOME on a variety of different things, but if you do not like GNOME and you want to use Zoom and you are on Wayland, you are just raw out of luck. So as of June 24th, 2020, we only support Wayland on GNOME with Ubuntu 17 and above, Fedora 25 above, Debian 9 and above. October 2022 Zoom, you need Pulse Audio 1.0 above to support audio share on a system that uses Pipewire Pulse Audio, because Pipewire uses Wayland. So Wayland breaks automation software. Wayland breaks global app menu, global menus for GNOME. So even on GNOME, it's not working all the way. Wayland broke global menus on KDE. Oh, broke it there too. Wayland breaks global menus with non-KDE Qt plugins. Wayland breaks app images that don't ship with a special Wayland Qt plugin. Well, that's neat. So if you're using app images and those app images do not have the special Wayland Qt plugin, they will not work either. Wayland breaks Redshift. That's okay. I hate Redshift anyway. Wayland breaks global hotkeys. All right, fine. We'll go back to that redshift. So it basically, the redshift works by doing a color adjust, which is unsupported. However, a few Wayland compositors such as Wayfire now support it. That's an update. Wayland breaks global hotkeys. Wayland does not work for XFCE. Maybe not. I think the XFCE development with Wayland is moving along pretty well. Does not work properly on NVIDIA hardware. So if you're running NVIDIA graphics cards, why are you doing that to yourself on Linux? But anyway, if you are, it may not work. Not work properly on Intel hardware. Bummer. This laptop's Intel. This one apparently is fixed. Biased towards Linux and breaks BSD. Well, that's okay. You know. Okay. Yeah, so BSD is still a work in progress with Wayland. Complicates server-side window decorations. Breaks windows erasing and activating themselves. So something that might need to get your attention, a notification type thing. Breaks rescue time. Okay. Breaks window managers and requires Wayland requires JWM, TWM, XDM, ICE window manager to re-implement Xorg-like functionality. And this is really how you fix Wayland on anything that's broken. It should be a meme. We should create the giant meme for it. Wayland doesn't work. Just start the X server and use the Wayland plugin to call the X server. Great. Wayland works everywhere. You know, it's kind of the part of the problem. So it's trying to fix these things, but it just breaks about everything. And particularly for me as a Linux content creator, I need stuff to work, particularly if I'm trying to do screen sharing and things like that. Like getting the scam thing, or I showed you guys the Facebook scam last week. That was a pain to record because everything I was working with, Cubes is completely cross-isolated, and then Tails was Wayland. I believe Tails was Wayland, which is why Simple Screen. I think it was because Simple Screen Recorder was telling me that, but there's no other good screen recorder on it because screen recorders on Wayland just don't work. So we do need to be cautious as we dive headlong into Wayland and kill X, because it's going to cause a lot of industries and a lot of things in the Linux community to become more broken and more fragmented. But Wayland seems to be only concerned with supporting the big guys, Gnome and KDE. And this is the exact behavior in Linux we're trying to prevent. We do not want one single group taken over, because, Gnome gets taken over by the weirdos, and then now we're completely stuck because we have let weirdos compromise everything. So we need to keep X going. We need to keep it strong, or we need to get Wayland, get its head out of its butt and get it to fix everything on its end, not rely on other third parties to fix all of its own shortcomings. They need to move beyond, hey, it works on my computer on Gnome, therefore everybody's seeing it the same way. We need to move beyond all of that, and we need to start working on, on real ways of doing things. So that is kind of my thought on it. I don't completely hate Wayland. I will be happy if Wayland starts working everywhere, but this is enough to get us to say maybe we should be cautious about diving headlong into pushing Wayland down everything. That's my thought. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below.
Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.